Emily had experience with Ogilvy, then had great experience with the Case Foundation. She has run a nonprofit herself and then launched AI PRIORI, which is an AI organization focused on helping community organizations have a greater impact. So no one better to have this conversation with and ask questions from than Emily Yu. Emily, we are really excited to have you with Leadership Greater Washington.
Thank you so much, Mahan, for that lovely introduction, and for the whole LGW team. This is so exciting to be able to be part of this AI series. And might I just add, since I spent all my time thinking about this intersection of AI and social good, LGW is really taking the lead, and I think in a positive way, on having these conversations and creating that group, that network, Mahan, that you're talking about, to be able to explore these topics. So thank you so much for having me. And I promise we won't get too technical today, but we can go there if you want in the questions. But this is really going to be more about sort of the strategy and thinking that we can employ on business and social good. So I think you all in this group in particular are particularly well suited to be thinking about this topic and the future of AI. And as an extension, I've spent the past year talking with close to 100 business leaders, nonprofit practitioners, community members, and issue area experts, including those in DC specifically, about their efforts to use AI to address some of society's most pressing challenges. Things like food insecurity and healthy housing, transportation access, and maternal and child health. And I wanted to share some of the concerns and topics that they're grappling with, just as a sort of a seed to plant in case you have questions or want to explore it down the road. Data, workforce, Mahan just mentioned this, strategy and workforce component about AI. There's also fundraising, so we can always chat about that down the road. But the one I really wanted to focus some of the opening comments on and this conversation around was one question that ran true through all of these conversations, which is, where do I, as a business leader or as a community leader, where do I and my organization belong in this AI conversation today? Now, the context for that, and some of you may feel the same way, they're not building or designing AI tools right now. They don't have a machine learning specialist or maybe a data scientist on staff who's coding and building with these computer models. They're waiting, they're seeing what's going to happen with all the regulation concerns. I mean, us being in DC, we're not strangers to what's happening in terms of law and policy. So regulation's a big concern that's causing some hesitancy. And it's also really expensive. I don't want to ignore that. That's also one of the downsides, right? Right now, we're not quite at that stage where we can just plug and play, kind of like with website development, how we sort of used to have to hard code everything. And then now we're sort of at this place years later where you can drop and drag different components of a website, and then you have a website built. We're not quite there yet with AI, right? And so a lot of these factors are creating an environment in which folks in nonprofit sectors or smaller businesses, or maybe your organization, there isn't quite this urgency or use case right now for dealing with AI. But what I wanted to share with you all, and what I've come to realize after these 100+ conversations and with AI Priori, is that as organizational leaders, and as Mahan mentioned, right, as community leaders, there's a lot at stake when it comes to the future of AI. And so we, who sit at this intersection of business and social good, we actually have a very critical role to play in the future of AI. And specifically, I want to call out the development of AI tools that are more sustainable and more equitable. And many in this field call this area responsible AI, generally speaking, right? So I want to underscore that this role in advocating and championing for responsible AI also doesn't require us to necessarily build AI tools, and we don't have to compete with the tech companies or code anything, right? It comes down to us being able to apply a community-centered lens and practices to AI design and development. So here's why this matters for you and your organization and the communities that we serve, right? Right now, because of some of those obstacles and challenges that I mentioned, the cost, the staffing, the technical expertise, et cetera, for many of those reasons, AI's design, build, and governance, it's really concentrated in the hands of select tech companies and organizations, Most of those have many users. They have advertisers, they have subscribers, they have a network that can help them fund and develop this technology. I'm thinking about the ChatGPTs of the world, the Bards, the Zapiers, and the Otter AIs that some of you might use for transcription, right? These are more tools that are built expressly to reach the most people and raise the most revenue, right? And because of that, that is creating this sort of pipeline, this natural order, if you will, a pipeline of AI tools that are coming to market. Now, I want to pause here because I'm generalizing a little bit. I'm talking about AI tools in aggregate. This isn't every single AI tool out there, but it makes sense, right? Tech companies need to recoup their expenses. And so my concern with that is that the AI tools that are being built, that are coming out to market, they're built for people, not necessarily with people. And it comes back to that community-centered lens that I mentioned earlier. So I want to share some context because this isn't necessarily a newfound idea. Andrew Ng of Deep Learning AI, he's been thinking quite a bit about this topic of this sort of prioritization or this pipeline of AI tools and this challenge of one size fits all tools that reach the most people and raise the most revenue, right? In his quest to make AI accessible to everyone, he framed this challenge as something we need to talk about and termed it AI's long tail problem. He has a really good TED Talk on this too, but I'll summarize it for you here. He shows this chart, if you will, that's this sort of sloping curve. And on one side, the vertical axis, he talks about value. So these are things like the revenue generation potential, et cetera. And on the horizontal axis, he has sort of time, right? You have things that are going to be built early in this timeline and things that might be built later on or at the long tail. And this is why he calls it AI's long tail problem. So on this sloping curve, he has things that are projects that have the greatest value and that will be built first and prioritized. Those are things that reach the most people and raise the most revenue. Things like ad generation that are AI powered, things like AI powered web search results, these things already exist, right? They're at the head of the curve. They're at the top value and head of the curve. And it's not until you get all the way to the other end or the long tail where you start to see more custom projects. These are things that might require unique data or information. Maybe it's specific to your organization or specific to a nonprofit group, right? It's their data set that's being used. And so it's very niche. It might reach less people because of that. And so it drives less revenue, right? And so that's why it sort of sits over on this long tail. And some of the examples you could imagine, maybe they're things like data synthesis and parsing tools that only look at they're trained on your data and your organizational data, right? So it's very specific in what it's looking for and coming back with. Or maybe it's things like workforce tools. Maybe they're very specific skill sets that you and your team need training on, right? And they're going to be tailored for your team. Or maybe they're capacity building tools for nonprofits and communities that are community driven. It's these sorts of tools that are going to be pushed to the end or sort of the long tail and take longer to develop and have less resources to develop. And that's a concern, right? Because this is despite the fact that they could have transformative impact in communities and have long tail significant financial gain. So I'm going to wind down here before we get into conversation and sort of frame this again, because remember, I started out sort of really focused in on this question people were asking about, what is our role? And in these conversations, I realized that our role could really be one about applying a community-centered lens to the future of AI so we could create more responsible AI tools and platforms. So to put a fine point on it, what I just described, this long tail problem, a lot of people across sectors, this isn't just nonprofit, this isn't just for-profit, a lot of people across sectors are asking questions like, how do these other long tail tools get built and when? Who designs them and who owns them, right? And I think these three questions represent a lot of the opportunity that we that sit at the intersection of business and social good can contribute to the future of AI. Because when we apply our community-centered lens and values to these sorts of questions, and again, we don't have to build anything, right? We don't have to code anything. These are in our strategy conversations we have with our board, conversations we have with our grantees and our community members and our partners. what if we are the ones who use our community-centered lens to reframe the question? So instead of how do these long tail tools get built, we instead are asking, how can these tools build community power, right? And instead of asking questions like who designs them, what if we're the ones that pause and think about how can we co-design them with those that are closest to and most affected by the issues these tools are meant to support? And rather than who owns these tools, what if we reframe that and think about how do we democratize access to these tools? And not only the tools, but the data that's used to train these tools, right? So that's just a quick snapshot of how, a lot of these peers in the nonprofit and business sector and communities, they're starting to see a way that they can have a role in determining and contributing to the future of responsible AI. Because we know that when efforts led by communities that build community power and that build community capacity, those are the tools that don't plateau, which is what the long tail problem shows. They don't plateau in value, but rather they have the opportunity to create real systems level change and be more sustainable for both financial and social impact. So I'm going to leave it there with that.
Yeah,
Thank you
and
so
that
much.
you ask some great questions for us to think about, Emily. Before we get to some of those, though, I know I make the mistake of assuming we all are speaking about the same thing. There was a study that, again, uh, restated that at this point, about 24% of Americans have even gone on ChatGPT, and a lot of people that I know have gone on ChatGPT have had it like come up with a poem or something. They aren't using any of the tools to fully understand it. So when you talk about AI, do you mind first explaining what it means, what you're talking about? And in terms of community impact or organizational use, therefore, what does it mean? So we've got homelessness, we've got hunger, we've got nonprofits that are working on certain issues. Can you put a context to what AI means, and then maybe give a couple of examples of how it can relate to either organizations and or community impact?
Of course, yeah. And I promised I wouldn't get all technical here. And there's no need to for this conversation in particular. I'm using AI in the context of define technically artificial intelligence, but when we unpack that, it's really a computer's ability to take data that we as people feed it, and basically it is able to find patterns and trends in other information. So that's how those queries in essence happen. And of course, I'm generalizing here, but every time we do ask a question of an AI tool like ChatGPT, or every time we might use an office tool that might sort of summarize our emails, right? Or schedule things for us based on our availability of our calendar. That's really, in essence, data that's been fed to a computer, and it's learned to look for different patterns or trends in that data so that we can then either predict or maybe streamline a process that we would otherwise have to manually do. And so I'll give you one example too. Let's say, Mahan, you and I were just talking about some office productivity tools, right? So for example, the calendaring tool, which I think a lot of people might use, you might have a calendar that is AI enabled. And so it asks you, hey, can I connect with your Outlook calendar or your Google calendar? Do you give me permission? And you say, yes, go for it. And so now it can read through all of your scheduling, and it understands when you have recurring appointments. It understands when you like to meet with certain people. It understands how long certain meetings might take based on the description you have, right? And so with all of that data that you've enabled the computer to see and access, now it can start to predict or help you by suggesting, hey, so and so on your team just requested a meeting. Might I suggest, this slot? And it does that not through any sort of magical process, but because you've given it the data it needs to be able to learn those trends. And then, Mahan, just to close out, I think some of the nonprofit or social sector impacts that we could really drill down on. a lot of the individuals and their organizations are really grappling with this concerns about data. Because I think one of the big challenges is I think a lot of people don't realize the volume. I know it took me a while to wrap my head around the volume of data that AI tools need in order to learn those trends and patterns. It's tremendous. And so two things arise that I want to raise. One, for nonprofits, and I've spoken with several people, both at foundations and nonprofits, about this. Anecdotally, we estimate that somewhere between 80 and 90% of nonprofits probably don't have enough of their own data set, for example, to make it worthwhile to create their own data, their own AI tool. They don't need to do that, right? And so there shouldn't be this sort of pressure to say, hey, if you want to get in on AI, you really need to design something or develop your own custom tool. That's really not the case here. And so I want to disabuse that sort of context. But what it does mean is really having a good grasp about the data you do have and asking your team the question of, do we need AI and how can we best use it? And so I think people that I've spoken with sometimes will jump to the conclusion that they need to build their own AI tool in order to stay up to date, or they need to hire an AI consultant to really find their leverage points. But after talking with the vast majority, again, the 80-90% of nonprofits, it's really probably going to be more a question of, hey, stay curious and keep learning and reading articles about AI. Talk with your peers about it, because very quickly we will start to see tools that are going to allow us to do more plug and play things with AI and with the data we have, even if it's not to train some sort of, unique tool. And I think that's really going to be a game changer for nonprofits, because we can do things like with AI Priori, for example, right? This idea of having so much content that it's overwhelming and we can't actually use it. I'll give you a not so fun fact. 66% of nonprofits report not always making data-driven decisions, right? Or designing with the end user in mind. And I thought for sure this stat has got to be wrong, right? Coming from the nonprofit sector myself. But when I thought about it more, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm one of those people. I had a situation in which I had over 8 years, we'd accumulated over 500 grant reports from different communities. And so similar to data you might be sitting on at your office right now, right? I was like, okay, we do evaluations every couple of years, and I think that's fine. But once we crossed 500, I thought, what could we possibly learn if we looked across all 500 reports? But to do that, we would have had to manually review every single report and tag and code everything. You guys probably have done this yourselves. It would have cost 6 figures and months of time. So Mahan, you'll chuckle. We didn't end up doing the 500 review, but I never wanted to be in that position again, right? That's data I had. There was no reason not to, other than lack of time, capacity, and resources. So, I set out to use AI. I thought AI is tailor-made to, again, have data fed to it, look for patterns, and train it to be able to help me streamline these processes, like content review. I want to be able to ask it to parse my documents for X, Y, and Z. Why can't I, train a computer model to do that? And so that's what we're testing right now. But I hope that's a long-winded way to answer your questions.
Yeah, no, it does get to it, Emily, and I appreciate that. One perspective I love. I got started in trying to understand data AI actually about 5 years ago. One of the books that got me started. It's an outstanding book called Prediction Machines by H.J. Agrawal, and part of what he mentions is the fact that AI brings down the cost of prediction to almost nothing, and the effectiveness of it goes drastically higher, which in essence means, based on, as you said, based on the appointments you've had, the AI will know what kind of appointments you would want to have in the future. By the way, that's where some of the ethics and other elements of it go into play also. So, for example, right here in DC, the police department does use AI to determine where crimes will happen before they happen. Now, how effective it is, what biases there are in it, we can have different conversations. But when you have data from the past, that data in many instances can very accurately, through AI, detect patterns that determine where things will be in the future. So that's I think part of the struggle that I see a lot of times people have is, so we've got data AI, what does it mean? If we know where people are, let's say what time of day, where they are going to get food, or whatever else it might be, we can very accurately predict the behaviors of the groups in the future. That's what AI can do. Let me get to question Sharon posted in chat. Then I see one in Q&A also. I'll go there. Please, Emily, can you please be more specific and concrete in describing what you mean by community sustainability?
Yes, thank you, Sharon. That's a great question. And Mahan, you actually had that lead in with the cost piece. So in my experience, in the context in this talk, I was talking about community sustainability in terms of the sort of viability, the financial viability and long-term resourcing for these sorts of efforts. So for example, one of the biggest challenges for a lot of the communities that I worked with when I was executive director of the Build Health Challenge was this idea of sustainability, because we were doing grant funding. And so this sort of vicious cycle, right, of having to always be fundraising and seeking additional dollars to support the continuation of the work or the sustainability of the work was such a drastic sort of pull on their time and resources as a team that oftentimes would detract and distract from the work they were doing with us as Build. And so I say that as AI has the potential, and responsible AI specifically has the potential to enhance how nonprofits and other organizations too, but for this conversation, nonprofits could enhance their own time, capacity, and resources to support longer term sustainability of their projects.
Yeah, and that's why it's important to sort of have a structured thought process to it. So I'll get to Amber's question in a minute. Gregory asks, what are some challenges you can see with keeping bias out of data uh, uh, created by AI? Gregory, actually, the AI is fed the data, but in essence, he asked about that bias and how can we prevent it, Emily?
Yeah, that is great, Gregory. I just read an article actually about some loan, I don't think it was mortgages, but loan applications that were using AI. And they discovered that there was a significant amount of bias because the data was biased. So the outputs that the AI was giving the users were biased against certain different populations and also certain different geographic areas in different communities. Which again is a significant problem, because I'll add, for those that might be curious, right? It's not like we can just go back in. It's not like AI leaves us a paper trail, right, Mon? It doesn't just tell us, hey, this is exactly how I came up with this output for you. And so there's a real challenge at uncovering that bias, and also what do you do to address it and account for it? And so I think the question, I think I was trying to address the bias. So how can you account for it? So what I'd say right now, and it's still early days, so take it with a grain of salt. On the surface level, there are a number of groups out there that have tools. They claim they're auditing tools or testing tools to help you find and suss out bias within your algorithm, but also potentially within your data. Now, I haven't used a ton of those tools, so I can't speak for, and I'm not trying to vouch for these tools, but that is one sort of off-the-shelf solution that could be helpful, and that I know a lot of companies are leaning in on. I will say, having done AI Priori like from scratch and trying to build that out, you're spot on with the data, right? And so this idea of who is creating the data and how are you using it is key, because you could feed an algorithm the best data or the worst data. And again, you're not necessarily going to know how exactly it came out with your output. So it's critical that you have some sort of transparency and accountability in your data. I'll say, from the nonprofit perspective, something that is really resonating with people and that I'm trying out with AI Priori is exclusively using community-centered data for some of the models. And by that, I mean actually partnering with nonprofits, community members, issue area experts who have expertise in a topic like healthy housing, like food insecurity, and having them create proprietary data sets. And so this is something you might do on a small scale. I'm just piloting it and doing it sort of with off the shelf tools on the trial. And basically I compensate and pay those partners for the data that they're providing. And so I'm using that and training a model. And you can find models like on Amazon or on, Google has other software you can use, and basically trying to train smaller models to see, am I going to get better results? Am I going to get things that are more specific to the question I asked? And so far it's panning out. But I think there is, this underlying question as tools like ChatGPT and Claude. Mahan and I were just talking about Claude the other day, actually. They're getting exponentially better, faster. So I think if you can navigate that balance between community-centered data or your organization's data, and those are like gold standard, to these sort of larger databases of tools like ChatGPT, Bard, Claude, and find where your comfort level is on that spectrum in terms of bias or transparency or sort of the ethical implications. I think you'll be able to find a sweet spot that works for you and your organization.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on my end on that, Emily. First of all, with clients, in some instances, I have them use Claude AI, and then ChatGPT has a code interpreter where
Mhm.
you can have it analyze back data, Excels, or whatever else that you have, and try to determine patterns in it. To the question, the data can have biases in it, which is why then judgment afterwards is
Well
important.
said. Well said.
However, I would encourage you to start using and start experimenting. And here's the reason why. Organizations are already using these things. When people apply for a job and go through an applicant tracking system, that's an artificial intelligence. And are there biases in it? You better bet there are biases in it. Afterwards, they can look at it. For example, Amazon had implemented one, and then they saw it spits out a lot more male candidates. They hadn't asked for that, but the data it was pulling from were primarily men graduating from certain schools. So those were the type of people the AI was pulling out for them. So some of the biases can also be caught afterwards with
Mhm.
human judgment applied to it. However, I encourage people to start experimenting and understanding it and its applications, not waiting for the perfection in the data before starting. A couple of other questions for you there, Emily. Anne Sorensen says, how can developers or users address the issue of bias in data? Many data sets used in AI tools are based on users in the US or Europe. What are some steps we can take to make tools more applicable and useful for people elsewhere in the world, e.g., Latin America, Africa, Asia? As an example, my organization, Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team, HOT, is interested in using AI to create maps. Current tools work in the US, but not in the communities in Africa where buildings may not be rectangles and road surfaces are different. So AI mapping models that are trained on US European data do not work well.
Wow, that's a big challenge. I wish I had like a great snappy answer for you on that, but part of it I think is one, kudos for just articulating and identifying the challenge because that's what the sector, and I'm talking about AI development, that's what we need to identify because when we call out a specific use case or challenge, that's when we can really attack the problem. So a couple things come to mind. One, I don't know if because you're mapping in certain communities, if there are data sets that you, or excuse me, organizations you could partner with potentially for creating those data sets. And there's also enhanced value in doing that because if there are fewer data sets available that cover that topic, so maybe it's housing and mapping, perhaps there's a way to monetize that or bring in other value for your team and for other partners. I will say, aside from like creating your own data set, right? And again, perhaps using a community centered approach to creating your data set, I think another way to think about it, There is this sort of technique because you mentioned developers, and so I'm going to get a little bit technical here. There is some AI technology that's frankly kind of exciting. It helps people fill in the gaps on data. So again, take this with a grain of salt because we just talked about bias. So I'm not trying to say this is the end all be all tool, but it's pretty exciting because you're not the only one with this data gap challenge, right? And if we don't have enough ingredients to feed the AI machine, then we can't train it. So how do we fill that gap? And so there are certain tools, and I'm happy to share some emails after the fact that I've seen come across that are making headlines because they're able to look at smaller, more, it's probably more curated data. And then it's able to actually predict and help fill the gaps. And so you get that volume of data that we were talking about earlier that you need to train the models, the computer models. So that could also be a potential solution. And you could play around with that until you, again, get to a spot that you're comfortable with in terms of the accuracy, but also the potential bias that might be infused.
As someone related to that, Amber says we are trying to think through a policy on how to use AI for our work while thinking
Mm.
about confidentiality and bias. Are there articles and thought leaders to help or ideas on how we can do this? Also, what are your thoughts on algorithmic discrimination?
Oh wow. Okay. So I'm sorry, Mahan, I'm the first, the last one was like, yes, let's go there. So the first one though, it was on, I
In
apologize.
essence, I think Emily, it's Amber is stating a question that I hear almost as soon as I talk to anyone I bump into, including last night. People say, "So tell me, where should I start? How should I start? Resources, thoughts on a policy for the use." And everyone has heard about, oh my God, you should be careful with the data and the questions you ask, whether in ChatGPT elsewhere.
Yeah.
So, are there thoughts or resources on policy and approaches to using AI at work?
Yes, thank you. And I just dropped into the chat for everyone, data.org. Data.org is great. I can't recommend them highly enough in terms of a free resource and sort of community to really dive deep into not only AI, but data more fundamentally, right? They have, I just saw this, a great data governance worksheet. So it's like it sort of helps you, it prompts you to think about different questions and elements about how your organization interacts with data to help you as a stepping stone inform your AI policy and strategy. So I highly recommend that, and that's free and available now, and they have a ton of great stuff on there. And then as far as the algorithmic justice goes, that's an area that I am interested in, but not I have not dived really deep into. But I will say there's a tremendous amount of great work happening right now from a number of different leaders in that space. I think there's a group actually called the Algorithmic Justice League. I'll try to find that and share that with Mahan so it can maybe be shared later. But it's groups like that that they're really diving hard into these questions. And so I find it useful because one, it puts a use case or a story to the different ways algorithmic bias and injustice happens. And I think that's one of the key things here. We shared a few examples about bias, but they really dive deep and what can be done about it or what is being done and who's advocating for changes, right? So I think that site and that group might be really helpful, and they have great newsletters. And I'll share a couple others with Mahan afterwards that might be able to be networked.
Wonderful. We have another question, and I have a couple of thoughts on this also. Where are there AI workforce development training resources on the existing AI tools that you recommend?
Yes, yes, 100%. Oh, I just shared this with somebody else. So I will say some of the great places to start. One, YouTube. It's crazy. You can go down the rabbit hole, but any sort of tutorial you're interested or any question you have could be really well served by a couple minutes if you're, especially if you're visual, on YouTube. But I will say more specifically, places I tend to go to and point others to because I sort of know they're curated and validated. So Amazon, AWS, that platform, not only can you sign on and create an account through AWS, again, Amazon, but they have an entire section, as does Microsoft, might I add, on nonprofit use of AI. So it's very tailored, it's very specific, and it takes you from literally zero to as far as you want to go. It is tailored for people who are technical, who are the developers and coders, but also for executives or practitioners who are not necessarily steeped in AI and they just want a primer on a topic, right? And that's so they can have a conversation. It has all that and it's free. And then if you want to get in, you can then sign up and then tinker in with some of the tools, right? At no cost or for a trial. So AWS and Microsoft, I will say, are really good. And then two other things that, if we have time here, I'll try to drop in or I'll share with Mahan. One of the other big time savers I use, and Mahan, you probably do this too, newsletters. There's some really good AI specific newsletters because I don't know about you, but I cannot keep up with the headlines and the news and like the latest app that just came out. It's too much. And so I subscribe to literally, I think, three different newsletters that I love. And every morning I get the digest and I'm like, okay, boom, boom, boom. And I'm like, oh, that looks interesting. I want to experiment. I'll play with that. And the rest, if it's not relevant, I just sort of squirrel it away. But that sort of combination of curated resources as well as those sort of quick hit tools keep me current, but also let me go deeper on AI.
I totally agree with you, Emily. I also subscribe to a bunch of
Mm,
newsletters. So feel free to email Emily or me for specific recommendations. That was an anonymous question,
okay.
and happy to let you know the newsletters that I recommend. As Emily mentioned, AWS has great free resources. Microsoft has great free resources. Google has great free resources. Google's is a little bit more targeted at people that want to develop AI tools, but still, one of the things, there is a lot of great content on YouTube, but there's also a lot of people that teach you how to make $1 million in half an hour with ChatGPT. That's my concern typically in recommending general people on YouTube. But you could make $1 million in half an hour using ChatGPT if you watch the right YouTube videos. There are also some of the people that I've had conversations with for the podcast, and we've had as guests on Leadership Today series. The first one was Tom Tolley, who had written a book on AI basics, has now written a book on generative AI, has a great course. So there are lots of resources. Start with one of these big three that provide great, credible insights for free, and then the newsletters. I love Ben's Bites and the rundown as well, Emily. So wholeheartedly agree with those. Thanks for putting those in chat. Now let me get to Jamie's questions. Jamie says, in the nonprofit sector, all models have built models on giving trends. AI is identifying prospects with little or no giving. How can we build trust with AI?
Let me see. I want to make sure I get to the heart of the question. AI is being built without giving. Do you have any insight or if the person wants to share a
Yeah,
little bit more?
Jamie, if you don't mind clarifying uh, the clarifying the question, because I'm not sure I understand it enough to be able to help you with that, Emily.
It sounds interesting though. I want to dig into it.
Yeah, again, it's the data you feed it can produce different types of predictions. It sees patterns that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. That can be of tremendous value. So I know we spent a lot of time on the potential biases, and we do need to mitigate and be aware of those.
Mm.
But believe me, there is insane patterns that even some of the simplest AI tools, not they are not simple. The ones that are openly available, like the GPT code interpreter, you have to be a $20 a month subscriber to GPT to be able to use code interpreter, but it does very sophisticated
Mm.
analysis and shows you patterns that I don't think any human with any level of experience would have been able to pull out. So let's see. Um,
Well, if I could, the one thing I'll comment on that, we didn't really get into the whole concept of hallucination, or essentially one of the major critiques of some of the large platforms like ChatGPT and Bard, any of those that are using this sort of vast treasure trove of data, there's this critique that sometimes, because their whole job, the whole reason they're designed is to be able to predict what you are either going to ask next or what the answer is, right? So in predicting, they're basically creating something that might not yet exist in the answer. And so there's this whole critique that sometimes these platforms are prone to hallucinate, and there's some degree of hallucination that may happen. The answer they could give it, just as an example, you could ask it, hey, who wrote XYZ book? And it could give you the name of an author, a birth date, where they live, past books they wrote, right? And it's been known to say, like, wow, when I actually look at who that author is and Google that person and try to validate it, that person doesn't exist, right? It's a compilation of other people that it's put together from the data that it's been given. So I will say the one thing in terms of building trust and whatnot, I would say Mahan's spot on. I agree that the sort of take it with a grain of salt approach, and know that, in a way, AI is really there to augment us in terms of our skills, our knowledge, and whatnot. It's really, I would recommend against sort of wholesale, like, hey, do this for me and then consider it done. That validation, that checking, that human piece, is really important at the end, and may help deal with some of this trust building. The only other thing that dawns on me that makes me think, um, you know, the prompts. Mohan, we didn't actually get into this, but the prompts, the questions you ask things like ChatGPT and Bard, are almost just as important, as sort of the data that it's being fed. So in the questions or prompts that you ask it, so the funny, like, hey, write me a poem. Instead of just stopping there, you could be like, write me a poem in the style of my favorite poet, right? Reflective of this tone for this audience. I would encourage people as they play around to not just stop at the core question, but think about different elements or how to add color to that question to get more of a response, including things like, show me your sources. Hey, ChatGPT, thank you for the answer. Please cite your sources, right? There's nothing stopping you from asking that and then validating the source list that it gives you.
Yeah, and a couple of things. First of all, in GPT's playground, you can increase or decrease the heat, I believe it's called. In essence, you can give it
Mhm,
flexibility to be creative.
mhm.
So if you want creative responses, that is what leads to hallucination, or you keep it very factual. So you can increase or decrease that. There are those opportunities. There are a couple of other tools that ask those types of questions as well. So, Emily, as we're starting to come to top of the hour, I know a lot of people in this conversation are interested in next steps organizationally and next steps from a community impact perspective.
Mhm.
Would love to get some of your wrapping thoughts on what should be our next steps. Okay, we should educate ourselves. Thank you for putting Ben's Bites rundown. Those are great, credible, wonderful newsletters and resources and thoughts. But tell me, what should I do and what should we do in the community?
Yeah. I think it actually comes back to what you said at the top of this conversation, Mahan, and that's experiment. There are so many tools out there that I know I feel it myself that it's overwhelming and like I can't possibly try every single tool out there, but I can try a few, right? And those newsletters help me actually curate what I'm going to try. And it's usually free. And it's usually just a couple minutes out of your day to sign up and give something a shot. I will say the experimentation is almost just as important as the education piece of it. Because you can read, we've all been there. You can read something on your computer and be like, okay, I understand that. But it's not until you actually try it that you really can grasp the sort of utility or the implications of that tool. And that's really where AI is sort of this game changer for us in the social sector. I think right now there's a plethora of tools that are maybe focused on more like office productivity tools, or we mentioned, web ad generation tools, things that are going to, again, at that pipeline we mentioned, reach the most people and make the most revenue for those tools. And we're starting to see, and I love the mapping example, we're starting to see, not hopefully not as long as the long tail to wait for them, but we're starting to see more niche projects start to come to the fold. People are able to take what they've experimented with and build on top of it. So similar to how when the internet, happened and everybody's like, wow, look at all this information and access we have. And then the apps started coming out, right? So I feel like there is a similar trajectory happening here, which again, we don't necessarily need to code or do anything, uber technical here. But soon enough, we're already starting to see applications where we can say, hey, ChatGPT is great. Can I add my data to their data pot and get something more specific for me? And those things are already happening. The code, the example of ChatGPT is great. I know people that are non-technical who are asking ChatGPT, they're like, hey, write me code to do X, and it will give you back the code. And they just hand that off to somebody else or plug it in themselves into WordPress, and voila, right? So these things, we're on the cusp. I don't want to, give you any misillusion here. We're on the cusp, but because you're experimenting and because you're reading articles and you're just curious about these tools, it's going to position you and your organization as you not only think of your AI strategy, but also I can't stress this enough in all the conversations I have. The AI conversation, it's not really a technical only challenge or strategy. It's an organizational strategy that we're talking about here. We are fundamentally changing how we operate as an organization, as a team, as a community because of AI. So again, I'm not trying to say AI is the end all be all and everybody needs to code or build, not at all. But if you aren't aware, as Mahan mentioned, of what's happening around us and the tools that are coming out, your organizational strategy, your fundraising strategy, your revenue generation strategy are all at risk. And that is, I think, at the end of the day, what we're talking about when we say, what is our role? And when we extrapolate and add in the social element, which we all know comes full circle, because the community you're supporting, those are your employees, those are your customers, those are your partners, right? All of those community members and stakeholders have a role to play in AI. You just got to figure out what that sweet spot is for you and your organization, and then translate that into your strategy. And I'm so thankful that some of these questions came up, because data.org, great place to start. Those newsletters, great places to start in terms of crafting what's right for you.
What a powerful way to state it, Emily, and I couldn't agree with you more. If we look at these things that we carry around, it took about 10, 15 years to transform many of our relationships. Think about social media, think about how we communicate with each other, think about how we drive, think about accessing our information at work and elsewhere. AI, in my view, will be more transformative than this and faster. So good for all of you for choosing to join us here and watching this session. And Emily, I'm so thrilled with AI Priori, what you are doing. And we look forward. You are right here in Rockville, Maryland. Actually, you're in DC. So we are going to have you in one of our LGW events, give you big physical LGW hugs, and good luck with the organization because you are putting AI to good use, making a positive difference in our community. I'm really thrilled about that. Jasmine, if you don't mind putting the link, oh, you have put it on, outstanding. Jasmine has put a couple of links, a SurveyMonkey link and upcoming events. We do have our next conversation is with Gustavo Rossetti. Brilliant guy, has done the Culture Canvas, a bunch of other things, outstanding best-selling books, including his most recent is Remote Not Distant, talking about the challenge of hybrid work. And so awesome seeing you all, and you're getting great shout outs here, Emily. Really wonderful. Thank you all for taking your time for joining us. Thank you, Emily, for the great work you're doing to make a positive difference with use of AI. Great seeing everyone.